Hello, I'm Mark Payne. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the West Virginia Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. These presentations are both entertaining and educational. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of civic groups. Their presentation fee is paid by the council, and we ask only that their travel costs be covered by the host group. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Pearl Buck or Chief Logan come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures and make them more real. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. The presenters on the History Alive roster have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Alive presentation is not a play. It is very much an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Alive presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format just a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Alive presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio noted author from Wheeling, Rebecca Harding Davis.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Harding Davis, but I choose not to introduce myself to you with pretty and polite words that you will soon forget after I leave. Instead, I choose to introduce myself to you by giving you an excerpt from my most famous work of literature, a groundbreaking work that startled and staggered all of America, a work called Life in the Iron Mills. Allow me to bring a small portion of that story to you. Come with me to the dark satanic mills of Wheeling, Virginia in the 1850s. There is a story down there in the nightmare fog. I want you to hide your disgust, to forget your clean clothes, and come right down there with me. I want to make it a real thing for you. Do you know what it is to live in a town of ironworks? The great idiosyncrasy of the town is smoke. Smoke on the wharves, smoke on the yellow boats on the dingy river, clinging in clouds of greasy soot to the house fronts, to the yellow poplars, to the faces of passers-by. Mules, dragging their cargo of pig iron through the narrow streets, have a foul vapor clinging to their reeking sides. It is a city of fires, fires in every horrible form, pits of flame writhing in the wind, cauldrons of fire over which stand ghastly wrenches stirring the strange brew. It is like a city in hell. There is a family there by the name of Wolfs who live in dark cellar rooms, earthen floored rooms with slime clinging to the floors. Their lives are lives of incessant labor, 16-hour days, terrible long days of miserable poverty. They subsist on rank pork and molasses. Such were the words that I brought to America with my story, Life in the Iron Mills. It was a story, the kind of story that had never been told before, and all of America took notice. It was a story about a place that had never been exposed, about lives that had never been told about before. Did I myself work in an iron mill? Of course not. I come from a family apart, not of great wealth, but of refinement and good education. But I had walked the streets of Wheeling, and I had seen those starved lives, that misery. And with some wild kind of courage, I wanted to put that story on the page. I had an insane ambition to be a writer. And so I set down the story and I sent it off to the Mount Olympus of magazines, the Atlantic magazine in Boston. How could I imagine that anyone would care about what I wrote? I was so far from the literary centers of the time. I was a spinster, 31 years old, still living at home with my family. I was nothing but a raw Western girl. And now, imagine with me a day in January 1861 when a letter arrived from the Atlantic magazine. I was so certain that it was a refusal that I carried it around for half a day, afraid to open it. And when I did, there inside was a letter from James T. Fields, the editor himself, offering to publish Life in the Iron Mills, my story, saying that he wished to publish more work, that he found my work fascinating. He sent a check for $50. And then there were more letters and more letters, and an offer from Nathaniel Hawthorne in Concord, Massachusetts, to come and visit there and meet the literary giants of the time. And in one dizzying year, 1861 into 1862, I was on my way. I suppose those people wanted to see what sort of human beings come up from the back hills of Virginia. And if they found me strange, I found them stranger still. Let me summon for you those memorable ghosts of Concord, Massachusetts, the literary lions. Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Mr. Bronson Alcott, and Mr. Nathaniel Hawthorne himself. Let me describe for you what it was like to enter their domain. One night at Wayside, Mr. Hawthorne's home in Concord, Bronson Alcott stood at the mantelpiece, his long gray hair flowing, his hands keeping time to these ore-ton sentences that spouted from his mouth. Mr. Emerson seemed very interested in what he was saying, but Mr. Hawthorne turned to me and with a look of mischief in his eye said, "And now He will tell you about pears. Pears, I said. Yes, pears. Mr. Alcott believes that an all-vegetable diet is the most healthy for body and spirit. He might begin talking about Plato or about some idea from the day's news, but he will always come back to the subject of pears and to the benefits of an all-vegetable diet. Presently, Mr. Alcott finished his diatribe about the benefits of an all-vegetable diet, and he sat down to a dinner of beefsteak. But it was not long before, once again, he came round to the subject of pears. Now, imagine with me, friends, being asked to participate in a conversation about the spiritual benefits of pears. Well, I was baffled and silent, just as you would be. It seemed to me that it was a fitting symbol for these ideas that these men had. They were so lofty and impractical. Their ideas were like beautiful bubbles blown from a child's pipe, all airy, in fairy colors, but distorted. Oh, so attractive, but impossible to pin down. Let me give you another example. Mr. Alcott had built for Mr. Emerson a bower for him to do his thinking in. It was a great structure, 2 stories high, made of saplings, all fitted out with seats and a desk, for Mr. Emerson to do his thinking in. The problem was, he had forgotten to make an entrance, a doorway. One could stand outside and admire it, praise it for being so artistic, but no one could walk inside. These men did not commune with the common folk. Their ideas were so insubstantial and so alien to those of us who had come from the rugged country. Oh, it was a glorious time for me, but I was disturbed by their talk of war. You see, they talked of war incessantly, but they had never seen the war. In 1862, I had come up from the borderlands, where I had seen the war firsthand, the filthy spewings of it. I had seen the burned out houses and heard the cries of the women. War does not ennoble men. It makes brutish men more brutish. Honorable men degenerate into thieves and sots. If war is an armed angel with a mission, she has the personal habits of the slums. Oh, I suppose, if the truth were stated, my zealousness is no different from theirs. It simply takes another form. I had an insane ambition to tell the stories of those whose stories had never been told before. Because you see, I believe that before we go out into the great silence of death, we should tell our stories. Not just the stories of our personal lives, but of the time in which we live, of the people we know and the places, the way they are. It is my goal not to change your mind necessarily, but to make history live and breathe for you in what I write. Thank you.
We're here with Wheeling author Rebecca Harding Davis. Mrs. Davis, I would like to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us today.
You're welcome.
Would you describe for us the Wheeling that you knew during the years that you lived there, which I believe was the mid-1830s up through 1863?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to establish how important Wheeling was during the time that I lived there. It's been said that there were two important cities in Virginia, and of course, remember, Wheeling was not yet part of West Virginia until 1863. There were two important cities in Virginia, one being Richmond and the other being Wheeling. So it was quite an important city. It was important because of the National Road. The major east-west highway through America came through Wheeling in 1818, and the Ohio River was a great source of travel with people going north and south. So it was a great crossroads of America. Now, the Wheeling I lived in as a child was an enchanted place because of the travelers that came through, the huge numbers of immigrants in their colorful native costumes. We saw Conestoga wagons and carriages with prancing white horses. It always seemed so glamorous and so exotic to us to see those children's faces peering out and realizing that after Wheeling they were going to disappear into the wilderness on some adventure with painted Indians and panthers and bears, maybe.
Were you born in Wheeling?
No, I was born in Big Springs, Mississippi. My father was, at the time, something of an adventurer. He was an English immigrant, and he did a little exploring of the South before moving our family to Wheeling, where he felt there were more opportunities. And my mother had come from Washington, Pennsylvania, which is nearby, so she was coming closer to home with that move.
What did your father do?
My father was a Wheeling insurance executive and a city treasurer there. He was an esteemed man in town.
Well, your story that you mentioned during your talk earlier, Life in the Iron Mills, has been described as a groundbreaking piece of literary work. Would you discuss the importance of that story?
Well, I like to point out that some critics have said that my story was published in the same month, April of 1861, as the attack on Fort Sumter, and that it had the same earth-shaking power. Now, that may be an exaggeration, but remember that at the time, these early 1860s and before, the nation's attention was focused on issues of slavery and abolition. And I brought forth a story of another kind of slavery, industrial slavery, and that type of human being and that human predicament that the people who worked in the iron mills lived under had never been brought into literature before. And I made no attempt to sweeten the ending with that story the way that many writers were prone to do in those days. It was traditional, typical for the endings to be very sweet and sentimental, happily ever after, and I made no attempt to do that.
Well, you left Wheeling in 1863 when you, or after you married L. Clark Davis. Where'd you go after Wheeling? Where did you live after?
Well,
your time there?
My husband and I married in Wheeling in a March snowstorm, and then proceeded.
Well, that's romantic.
It was memorable, unforgettable. And then we moved on to Philadelphia. I owe the fame of my story, Life in the Iron Mills, to the opportunity to meet my husband. He had read my story. He wrote me a fan letter, you might say, and we met, and I eventually moved to his home territory, Philadelphia, where we established our lives there.
Well, I understand that you have 3 grown children, and one of them, your son Richard, is often in the news. Would you tell us about him a little?
Oh, I'm most pleased to talk about my oldest son, Richard, who is, many people believe, this country's first adventurer journalist. They have called him Richard the Lion Harding, named after my family because he is so romantic and dashing and always in the news. They say he is the Beau Brummel of the press. Richard writes to me nearly every day, but I can hardly keep track of him. One day he is playing golf with the president, and the next day he is covering some coup in an obscure country in South America. You might also be amused to know that Richard is the model for Charles Dana Gibson's Gibson Girl Escort.
Well,
Richard is the male in those advertising posters.
I was not aware of that.
He's very handsome and very sought after.
Wow. You've had a long career as a writer. What other sorts of things have you written and published?
Oh my, I have written more than 11 novels, hundreds of essays and articles. I've served for more than 20 years as a contributing editor of the New York Tribune. I've also worked for the Saturday Evening Post. I've published children's work, hundreds and hundreds of pieces. I must confess to you, however, that my work has sometimes suffered because of this prodigious literary output that I have maintained, and I suppose that in some ways the quality has been inferior because I have not taken the time to write in the studied, careful way that I wrote when I wrote Life in the Iron Mills. My son Richard recently asked me for advice about his own writing career, and I said, "Never write for money, Richard. If you write only your best work."
Well, that's sound advice. You've lived in a time when women have become significant public figures. Harriet Beecher Stowe and Louisa May Alcott have gained recognition for their literary works, and Dorothea Dix has spoken out against the conditions in asylums. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton have led the movement for women's rights. How do you feel about this great change in women's roles?
Well, I believe that I am an initiator of reform, but through my pen. I have never joined clubs or social organizations. I have never made a speech, nor have I wanted to make a speech. I have great suspicion of matrons with their turrets of gray hair who take up causes of one kind or another and become a kind of social Gibraltar. I believe there should be wider roads open for women, but not necessarily different roles. I do value women's domestic life, the raising of children and the tending of the home and the husband, and I do not wish to see that dismissed. I do believe if there is an area that needs reformed now, it is what I call the disease of money getting. I believe that Americans are far too preoccupied with the pursuit of the dollar and not with the tending of the poor and other ways that individuals can help.
Yeah, well stated. At this time, I would like to introduce the presenter of Rebecca Harding Davis, and this is Ms. Deborah Connor of Parkersburg, West Virginia. Deborah, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in two forms.
You're one of our most popular and busiest History Live presenters. I know you travel all over and are on the road a good bit, so thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us today. So I want to ask you what I ask all of our presenters, which is about the character or characters that you portray. What was it about Rebecca Harding Davis that interested you to the point that you wanted to research and do a historical characterization of her?
When I was an undergraduate, I read a very important book called Silences by Tilly Olson. And the book was published in 1978, and it was at the forefront of the women's movement. Olson writes about how women writers were often silenced through the generations because of various circumstances. And she devotes a large portion of her book some 60 pages in fact, to Rebecca Harding Davis. And I was reading her account of Rebecca Harding Davis and life in the iron mills and realized at the time that this woman was from West Virginia. And I had never heard of her, sadly. So over the years, I just kept thinking she would be a great character because she's been forgotten. But at one time, Rebecca Harding Davis was the most important writer in America. And she had a long literary career, did many, many things to admire, was on the vanguard of the realist movement, although she never got credit for that. I think she was a much undiscovered character and ready and ripe for portrayal.
So do you think that her reputation has been resurrected to the extent that is appropriate?
Well, I'm sad to say that Rebecca Harding Davis is not a name that people seem to recognize. Now that I've begun to portray her and talk about portraying her, most people don't seem to know who she is. But I think it's important that History Alive characters not only be characters with great name recognition, like Robert E. Lee or Louisa May Alcott, but characters whose names are not as well known, but we can then educate the public on someone they would not know about otherwise.
Well, that's a good point, and that is indeed one of the objectives of the History Alive program, is that there are many worthy figures from history that we would like to help educate folks and enlighten them about their activities. But you put a lot of emphasis on the meeting in Concord with sort of the literary celebrities of the time, Hawthorne and Emerson. Is there a particular reason that you chose that as sort of a focal point?
Well, that material, those stories, which are her stories, it's not something I made up. Those stories come from a work that she wrote later in her life called Bits of Gossip. It was a memoir where she talked about those days in Concord. I chose that material, number one, because I think it's interesting, it's fun, it's spirited material, it's entertaining stories. But the other reason I chose it was because I think that really demonstrates her spirit as a West Virginian. You know, here she was, as she describes herself, a raw Western girl in the midst of these literary giants of her time. And she's able to fit in well, but also to stand back and realize that there's a separation between her and these people whose values she considers somewhat impractical and too lofty, too nebulous.
In the last minute that we have here, could you tell us quickly how you approached your research, or what some of the sources were? How did you learn in depth about Davis?
Well, thanks largely to the memoir she wrote, Bits of Gossip. That's been very useful. There are letters between her and various family members, and there are several good biographies. But I also credit Margaret Brennan of Wheeling, West Virginia, for being a kind of mentor to me as I learned about the city and about Rebecca's time there.
Okay. And with that, I'll note that Davis passed away in 1910 and is buried in Philadelphia. Deborah, thanks for being with us here for the History Alive show.
My pleasure.